Lou just handed me a note, so I have a very important announcement to make. If at all possible, could you please buy a few more books from Dale Ahlquist? Is that good enough? Okay, good. All right. It's pathetic, isn't it? Pathetic. Well, look, I'm very happy to be able to introduce a good friend of mine, Dr. Gary Hafer. Gary is a professor of composition and rhetoric at Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I mentioned this idea that he's a professor of rhetoric, not really to impress you, but to sort of warn you. Lou may want to keep his watch out and be careful about this one. But no, seriously, I've known Gary for about 20 years now. We met, back in the early 90s at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. We were both students there. And we actually met because the two of us skipped Greek class on a regular basis. And we would go down to the Glenside pub and, well, let's just say we would have our share of a few adult beverages and, eat and talk about our toys. In those days, it was the Macintosh computer. We talked about that all the time. I know it's kind of a cliche, guys bonding over beer and food and toys, but that's what it was. I guess things don't change very much, do they? But our relationship over the years has developed to something much deeper than just that. Gary and I realized pretty quickly in our relationship that we were both on the same ecclesial journey that would someday lead us both back into the Catholic Church. And at the time, of course, we were at Westminster, and we had stopped for a little while in the throes of the world of Presbyterianism. But our friendship got a lot deeper over the years. Gary didn't stay at Westminster, but we stayed close friends, and we were both involved in each other's journey, if you will. And that's what really made our friendship grow. And I think sometimes that we take friendship for granted, don't we? And I've thought about this, and I remember years ago reading some letters from the great Saint Anselm, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury back in the late 11th century. And Anselm talks about friendship as being something deep, something really deep, something profound. He said that friendship was designed to be an aid for you and I in the religious life. And I had never thought about that before, that friendship was really meant to be an aid toward the beatific vision of God. I thought that's pretty cool, isn't it? Imagine helping our kids try to understand who to pick as their friends when they think about friendship as being an aid to the religious life. But that's exactly what it has been, and that's been, in large measure my relationship with Gary over the years. Because really, we all have these great events in our lives that sort of shape us. I think of marriage and the birth of at least a couple of my children were like that. These profound events that are sort of stuck in our minds. But really, one of the most profound events for me as a friend was in 2007, being able to go down to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and watch my friend come into the Roman Catholic Church. And it was a very anticlimactic experience, he'll tell you. It was, no, really it was, and it was that way with me back in 2002 when I came into the church. And these days we're kind of reflecting on Newman a little bit, and you go back and read the Apologia, and he talks about how sort of anticlimactic it was, on a cool October day in 1845, he comes into the church. This little priest accepts him into the church, and it's sort of done, and probably they went out to the pub and drank beer and talked about their toys or something. I don't know. I guess in those days, the Victorians, maybe, I don't know, a new tea strainer or something like that. But anyway, it was very anticlimactic, and I went down there, and his wife and his kids, of course, were all coming into the church, and there we are in this big parish. It was just a handful of us. It was a private service, and I met the priest, who was a very nice man, didn't know me from Adam, and I'm not sure he really knew Gary. But we started the liturgy, and then, of course, to make matters worse, my child, Ryan, I think it was Ryan, who's normally just this angelic little boy, was possessed by a legion of demons. And he decided that it would be really fun to run to the back of the church and pull this lever that was bright, shiny red and had the word fire on it. And so right there, before Gary's getting ready to come into the church, the fire alarm goes off. And I mean, this wasn't just a fire alarm. This was like we had just broken into the Pentagon. And so we had to stop the service, and we had to, the poor priest had no idea how to turn this thing off, and the fire department had to come out. And I mean, it took us 20, 30 minutes before we were able to start this back up and get it done. But is that child still alive? Yeah, that child is still alive. But my point in all of this is to say that, as anticlimactic as that was, this little event, I want to tell you, it's one of the most important events in my life. It really is. To stand there with a friend and to watch that individual come into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, it was really one of the deepest and most moving moments of my life. And I've never even told him this, so he doesn't even know this. But it really, really was. Of course, after we were finished, we all went down to the pub and had beer and talked about the latest iPod or something like that. I don't know what it was. But really, it goes to this issue of friendship. Friendship is such an important thing, and Gary's been very influential in helping me to understand how eternal friendship really is. So please, with all that, welcome Gary Hafer, who's going to come and talk to us about education, what's wrong with it, and what it ought to be. Okay.
Thanks, pal. Feel a little tear coming on. What's wrong with education? Or the Calvinists are still among us. Reports Chesterton, when a man is asked to write down what he really thinks on education, a certain gravity grips and stiffens his soul. I confess to feeling that same rigidity of spirit when tasked with my present assignment, to discuss what's wrong with the world, but only with education. 100 years since its first publication. In my case, that feeling can only be accentuated when considering that every day the subject of education is in the headlines, creating greater tension, more polarization, more heat through division. Those headlines also betray deeper questions about education that probe us, define us as a nation and as a civilization, questions that burrow inward and register deep fissures with everyone. The apparatus for such a dig are contentious, seen in competing claims. You've heard them. What's best for our children? How we need to recover those educational values that are lost or forgotten. And what usually follows is a lot of pious advice that goes against ideologies and crosses them. That is, it is only one of those rare issues in the public sphere, like English-only legislation that refuse typical typecasting of conservative and liberal. I know of no other one that's quite like education. In fact, much educational policy in this country is all things to all men, no matter the political stripe of the measure. Yet paradoxically, we're also a nation of deep division, especially in education. Whether the issue is practical or theoretical, we are just as likely a nation of communities divided over whether a new school should be built or at variance over student improvement as the best measure of teacher performance. The only clarity we have is that things are very unclear, and that has been that way for a very, very long time. Okay, in 1 week, I recorded these kinds of theoretical questions about education in the headlines. Here I list them, and I'm going like a Japanese bullet train through them. What kind of universal public schooling is required to make an educated citizenry? What is the role of education in a representative democracy? Is a predominantly college-educated citizenry possible or desirable? How much administrative bloat exists in higher education? Does a liberal arts education still have a value? What is the best relationship among vocation and service and what Newman called learning for learning's sake? What are the modern dogmas that characterize modern education? And what do they mean for our nation as a whole? Then, of course, there are other questions that are more practical. And these are also prominent in the news. Here they are. In what ways do the large professional classes and bureaucracies occupying the Department of Education and the National Education Association, and even philanthropic agencies like the Gates Foundation, encourage and yet impede reform? To what extent do homeschool, cyber schools, online universities, and that big mix of the two, the mortar and the internet school, which is the next big trend, a merger of the two? We have a big one in Pennsylvania growing. How do they merit federal funding? How are they accredited? Who will do the accreditation? Should education lobbies, such as those financed by teachers' unions, be permitted to influence legislation and determine public policy? Should Western curricula be rewritten to incorporate minority and third world perspectives? Should grading and the reporting of grades be more representative of real learning? Should colleges and universities require achievement exams like the SAT, which is gradually fading away? What is the proper length of the school day? What, if any, is the role of religion? How do we justly and justify discrimination regarding the outcome of learners? Should sex education be part of a middle school curriculum? Is intelligent design a science or a philosophy? A mix or neither? How should it be addressed in the classroom? How should the federal and state government sponsor student loans and funding for higher education? I feel migraine coming on. Chesterton reminds us that one must keep one's temper in this madhouse. And so, despite the vast compounding of questions, no matter how hard you look, no matter how deep you dig, no matter how much dirt you sift, will you ever find a headline like this one? Modern education is chiefly Calvinistic. Yet that is exactly what Chesterton asserts in part 4 of What's Wrong with the World. Chesterton's claim that modern education is chiefly Calvinistic is just as timely, and maybe even paradoxically today, as it was in his own time. So what does he mean? What does he possibly could mean, since he tells us he's not giving us a theological explanation. After all, he cites George Bernard Shaw as a Calvinist, and even I, who hasn't read Pygmalion in 30 years, knows that Shaw has no overt religious affiliations. But maybe we need some background first to understand the connection. Calvinism, of course, is that Protestant movement of, and I'm going to be really hard, Christianized Stoics who believe that mankind is standing precipitously over the pit. At any moment, only by God's grace, there's a tentative kind of suspension. Its philosophy teaches that many, maybe most, of God's subject are ready to drop forever, a matter decreed by God before the foundation of the world. In Calvinism, everything is destined towards its predestined end. The elect to everlasting salvation and the damned to everlasting damnation. By the way, a bit of bad luck there on that last part. Man, moreover, is incapable of doing any good, and so therefore does no good. Only God can do good, which produces man who does good, and that's that migraine once again coming on. And here I need to tell you that as a former Calvinist, one who looked from the inside, not from the outside, that Chesterton is exactly right. So you could say in retrospect that I am predestined to teach on this topic today. What else but the cold, austere nature of Calvinism could parallel modern education in the various issues it encompasses, since it is, as Chesterton says, chiefly occupied in educating the child before he existed. Modern education, says Chesterton, is a kind of secularized Calvinism, having informed both sociology and eugenics as to its central doctrine that man is judged before he is born. That determinism forces all the pieces of the educational puzzle into one picture, whether they fit or not. Little wonder that Calvinism can be linked to modern education, because both have judged the fate of the child, and both are equally mistaken. Chesterton tells us that the soul of Calvinism is not a religious tenet, but the secularized proposition that man is disposed to a predetermined end, and nothing can change it. Like Calvinism, modern education is thus deprived of any transforming power. As Chesterton says, no word or gesture in Calvinism is significant or sacred. Nothing done in life can change its marching orders to the next. In modern education, everything is positivistic. It's certain. Even the environment will mold a child in only one particular way. Since education is a method, says Chesterton, or a transmission, it is easy to conclude that it is a tradition rather than a substance. Education is the teaching of dogma. In fact, it is dogma. One that Chesterton claims is seized by much moonshine and fads. Look at it today. No matter what method is adopted, continues Chesterton, they all share the same allegiance to authority, no matter their protests to the contrary. If Chesterton were alive today, I think he was here about 2 hours ago, what tenets of Calvinism would he see play out in the field of education today? I'm here to tell you I'm not sure. But I think he would level an assault against the kind of predeterminism of our own day as he did in his own. An attack against which is so absolutely sure of itself and its method so as to produce an educated populace in an exacting, prescribed way, a kind of materialism. The specific subjects Chesterton would choose, I cannot be sure. But as you might have gathered, I have a few candidates, okay? And each one of these, and I'm going to give you 7, I believe we can see how contingent our knowledge really is, especially as it relates to education, and that a good dose of healthy skepticism is a cure rather than a complaint. So here we go with my 7. Number 1, there never was a golden age of education that existed sometime in the past that could serve as an unqualified model for us to emulate today. Whenever I'm a guest at someone's house or at a party where there's a good number of people I do not know, the introductions always fall to occupations. In most cases, when I'm compelled to declare mine as an English professor, it's a conversation stopper. Over the years, I find that my profession sharing generates one of 3 equally dramatic responses. Here's the first one. That was silence, okay? Followed by the guest fanning away with profuse apologies, but always in the fewest number of words possible. The second is an act of contrition, in which the penitent describes in excruciating detail how he or she could never get a handle on English, even though the person is using that unhandled language right now to communicate with me. It ends with the guest describing Mrs. Grundy, not Chesterton's Grundy, but a close relative, the 4th grade English teacher whom all of us shared if we lived east of the Mississippi. But it's this third response I want to focus, which begins slowly and culminates into a rant. The complainant's feet climbing into an imaginary soapbox to tell me, no one can read and write today. No one could write a sentence, with lots of examples in tow. But they are to be forgiven, even the last one. For in the litanies against illiteracy, I hear similar chanting from colleagues in other disciplines, the mass media headlines, and my dad. What ties them together is the belief that there once was a golden age, a time of universal common standards, of unadorned literacy, a supposed era when good writing was easy and common. I have time for just 2 observations that can reconfigure that image. Shocked at the preparation of its incoming freshmen, Harvard University developed a writing course in 1870. Over 1/2 of Harvard University's opening class flunked the writing test, and that's Harvard. It spurred the development of a course because, in the view of the English department, freshmen, quote, could barely read and write. They could not even write a sentence, said the Boylston Chair of Rhetoric. Okay? John Quincy Adams was the first chair of rhetoric at Harvard. And after that, James Allen Smith. But equally surprising is that the English department created a writing course that most probably never had any writing instruction in. Now, how do we know that? We have artifacts and records that tell us that there were Latin grammars, there were grammatical exercises in Latin, of course, diagramming, elocution exercises, singing, all valuable in their own right, but at the expense of writing instruction. To compound the problem, Harvard's Adam Sherman Hill, who occupied that same chair, blamed teachers, guess what, at the secondary grade level. Does that sound familiar? Remember that college admission was unaffordable and academically unreachable to the majority of Americans until the passage of the GI Bill in 1944. and all the bills that came after that, in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even the 9/11 tragedy. As a result, taken together, millions of Americans now had access to college that had previously been the sole province of the wealthy and the privileged. The GI Bill spurred the open university concept, the community college, admissions, so that millions with weak skills and those unprepared in their previous schooling could gain access to a college education and all the kinds of educational opportunities that invitation afforded them. In 1947, for example, veterans accounted for 49% of college admissions. By the time the original GI Bill ended in 1956, 7.8 million of 16 million World War II veterans participated in an education or training program. My father was one of those. He returned from the Pacific Theater after World War II. He apprenticed as a machinist. He learned how to read intricate blueprints and technical writing, even though he had never finished the 10th grade. In those times, the colleges and universities and training schools welcomed their new freshmen. But if any of these, entering after the major wars, had been administered an entrance exam that showcased their reading and writing skills in the same way that we do today, in the headlines, as Harvard did in the 19th century also, they would have witnessed the public headlines and political campaigns and letters to the editor, which we see today. You know the adage that your great-grandfather was a printer, your grandfather was a printer, your father was a printer, you will be a printer, is no more, and it ain't ever coming back. You are not predetermined to be a printer before birth anymore. It is your choice. It is not eugenics, Chesterton might argue, but education that makes these choices possible in a free society. Education in the here and now. Okay, number two. Reform movements in education start out with good intentions, but over time, if they gain popularity, they will see their founders lose purpose or control, and perhaps even become self-refuting. Paul Peterson has a new book called Saving Schools, and he develops a similar thesis by looking at 7 movers and shakers in education. And when he looks at those, he tries to see what's common among them all. Even though they have different political viewpoints, they have different presuppositions, they have different religious beliefs, but it came down to the same thing, even with conservatives, that education must be centralized. This is what he said: shifting control of education away from parents and localities to professionals operating within larger legal entities, large districts, collective bargaining agreements, state governments, court jurisdictions, federal executive agencies, centralization became the almost inevitable byproduct of school reform, simply because reformers sought maximum power to carry their desires into effect. Jay Green from the Goldwater Institute, he's argued this for years, and there's a new study he just produced that shows the exact same thing. They all gravitate towards centralization. Now look at President Obama's race to the top. A policy of reform supported by liberals, and yes, by many conservatives before the current administration. This federal program awards states for producing schools with better test scores. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? A closer inspection reveals otherwise, like using unreliable measures, unstable criteria. But even these pale when compared to the centralization dogma at the heart of the matter. Dan Bowen at the University of Arkansas, for example, found this. that states with hotly contested Senate or gubernatorial contests, guess what? They received significantly higher scores. Consider another program, the Pay for Grades study, conducted by Professor Roland Fryer, an economist at Harvard University, which initially was applauded. This is where they paid students for various behaviors and also for improvement in test scores. One reporter said this, that the scores increased when they were paid to perform specific actions, such as reading books or wearing their uniforms. But it was all misreported. Fryer's actual results were mixed because the original study looked at different schools in different places and different pay-to-play schemes, as I call them. In Chicago, for instance, students were paid for higher grades, the rewards producing higher attendance rates and higher grades. But standardized test scores were not improved. In Washington, D.C., students were rewarded for non-academic behaviors, such as attendance, but no significant improvement. In New York City, this is the real focus of the study, the one that focused on what everyone seems to want, higher standardized scores, had no effect at all, and it surprised the researcher. Yet any seasoned teacher will tell you two things about incentive. They must be immediate and they must be certain. The condition to work hard to produce scores that may be acceptable on a final report card. Oh, by the way, that'll be a year or two down the line when we have the standardized test. Doesn't produce anything. It's an unwinning proposition. And of course, I'm leaving aside the moral repugnance of paying for grades. Number three, there is a good measure of uncertainty regarding what makes good teaching. Now, you might find that to be a curious opinion from a teaching award recipient. The educational establishment cannot accurately and reliably explain how its policies work, how these policies interact with their other policies, and what guaranteed benefits accrue to students over time. But the education profession is not entirely to blame. Look at the political system. Today, modern policies are based on predicting costs and potential benefits in the state legislature. That is why you can see in the state of Pennsylvania, where I'm from, that a bill requires professors, that's being debated right now at state-run colleges, to select textbooks that are the cheapest in the field. Who else but a bureaucrat would come up with such a criterion? As public policy, collectively, our politicians have little idea what they're doing. They're tinkerers with a system they don't understand and have no mechanism to seek that understanding. One cognitive scientist said that we need to formulate a policy that's understandable as a priority, like the lunar moonshot. But frankly, I can't see much public, political, or even educational support for it. Pretty heavy stuff. Educational policy today in America is incomprehensible because it's self-contradictory. The state boards issue reams of changes each year for teacher certification. I sat on one of these committees trying to implement it. There's never any justification for it, and no one knows why we're doing it. But we're going to do it anyway because we have to keep the machine moving. Second, research to develop a consistent public policy on education is difficult, even with cooperation among the various constituencies. Politicians, bureaucrats, unions, textbook publishers, and many others in the distribution system acquire better and more informed data of what the likely benefits would be. But we have no idea because it'll take 20 years of research minimum to determine that. How can we possibly succeed with such an enterprise when we cannot even align our standardized tests with a curriculum. Number 4, reading and writing are critical skills, but not for the reason most people think. Reading is a critical skill. This is a controversial one. Hardly a revelation, but we live in the age of Facebook, tweets, flashy advertisement, iPods, video games. Are these media bad for us? The answer is no. There is no evidence that any of the so-called new media are damaging our skulls or making us boneheads any more than the progression from the quill to the ink pen did. What is harmful is when that's all we get. That is, our literacy feast draws exclusively on a diet of new media. There are no books, there are no journals, there are no magazines. These provide a sophistication of thought and a depth of experience that the new media cannot maintain. There is richer vocabulary in the average preschool book than in the average television show aimed at adults. We find rich sources of information in books, magazines, and newspapers to the extent that we can prove that people who read a lot know a lot. A casual relationship between reading and having a broad sense of knowledge is the big relationship. If we line up children according to how much they read outside of school, the children in the 90th percentile read as much in 2 days as the children in the 10th percentile read in an entire year. In addition, the differences in children who read outside of school versus those who do not could alone explain the dropout rate. You know, there's a real plunge in male students going to college. Do you know that? Huh? But that is not all. There is also no substitute. But that is not all. There is also no substitute for knowledge, deep, persistent, comprehensive background knowledge. A few years ago, one seminal study looked at school children reading comprehension. One group was composed of slow readers, another of proficient readers. These judgments as to the students' reading proficiencies were formed over many years with their teachers as their judge. They gave each group an essay to read. They also gave each group an identical reading comprehension test. The weaker group produced better scores than the stronger group. Now, here's what I didn't tell you. The subject of the reading concerned baseball. I also didn't give you enough information about the two groups. The poor readers were well versed in baseball lore. The expert readers, not so much. You see, the poor readers connected their background knowledge of baseball to what they were reading. The expert readers had no such resource. So what should we conclude? Should teachers teach more reading strategies? Not so fast. Their shelf life is limited. These strategies pretty much offer a one-time benefit. More practice in the methodology does not produce better results. What do we need instead? We need more history. We need more literature. We need more writing practice. We need more science. More science means more writing. You want to teach writing? Teach science. It's pretty simple. No wonder it eludes us. Number 6, writing is still used at our elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools as a form of punishment. I have students every semester tell me horror stories because I require them to see me every week. And they tell me of lots and lots of horror stories about school-sponsored writing. Maybe you have a few. I will not talk in class, or to my neighbor, I'll write that 1,000 times. By the way, profs make terrible students, okay? Researchers who have interviewed prisoners in maximum security prisons have horrific stories of their classroom experiences, and almost all of them have to do with writing. But writing as punishment works in more subtle ways, too. How many of us in high school or college were promised a release from the dreaded research paper if we aced the last exam on the course? You know the research paper, that's the one that no one wants to write, no one wants to read. In such situations, writing becomes the punishment for a weak exam performance, all the while knowing, or maybe this is what we should know, that more writing with meaningful assignments that people care about produces better learning and more knowledge. Finally, number 7. The way things ought to be in education will only be available in heaven. Do you see my escape clause? We could assemble the best minds, the best theologians, the best educational theorists and cognitive scientists, and we still will find that we cannot know all the best methods, the best path to take in every situation. There is still the veil of unknowing. And there is always the temptation present to sway with our good intentions, finding in Chesterton's words, the new education is as harsh as the old. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying to make things better, to find out if our assumptions and priorities are the best. But we shouldn't think that education is the utopia. We need the real utopia for that, heaven, where we will be learning forever with the best teacher, the best methods, the best students who pass from glory to glory. So what do we do in the here and now? It is easy to succumb to despair when we see the spiritual and educational state of our country. But we can each redeem a very small piece of it in a significant way. The best one is to be the textbook definition of a parent. In What's Wrong with the World, Chesterton focuses on the breakdown of the family as one important reason for why what's wrong with the world. It is with many of the students that I meet. They come from broken homes and broken lives and are left alone to piece together a rickshaw of order for their own lives with no guidance. Their histories show parents who were never around, who never read to them, who never valued schooling or academic achievement, and even made fun of it. Many students I see in college even work hard to excuse their parents' infidelities, multiple marriages, illegal drug use, trying perhaps to be parents themselves in the vacuum. To see that need, one only needs to look at the growth of administrative personnel at colleges and in high schools, where positions are created to help those students who have no other help. In all our small ways, we can pave big pathways. Like Chesterton's description of the downtrodden, let us learn what is right in the way of what has been wrong. And oh, by the way, let's leave that Calvinism thing behind. Thank you.
We'll start up again around 2:10.